find out about that. Then there were, at one time in the 1880s, there were 6 agents, like this 87,000 IRS agents were going to hire. We had 6 agents in the Indian depredation claims that went out into the field to catch frog and find out is anybody not being truthful in that. And all of these claims, when they were awards given, were reduced by about 30% for amounts. And there's complaints in there, you know, they're saying, hey, I freighted this stuff out to Denver. And yes, it only costs this much money in St. Louis, but to replace it in Denver is this much. And the government wouldn't allow that, little things like that. Now, here's a little map of the Central Plains. Here's your North Platte. There's Fort Laramie. If you keep going up here about another 95 miles, I think it's Custer. And that's where, actually the North Platte River starts by Fort Collins in the mountains west of Fort Collins. And it goes north, way up to Custer, and it comes out down like that. And comes into Nebraska. And then you've got the South Platte River coming through Denver. And then the two join over here. And then you have the Arkansas River here, and you have the Smoky Hill Trail here. When I was living in Denver, I didn't get to do all of the metal detecting to locate these stage stops and stuff. I found many of them and got markers up on them now too, on 2 of them. So anyway, everything's here. From the fight at Beecher's Island, that should be Beecher Island. Some Springs, some skirmishes really in Kansas. You have Sand Creek here, and if you go down here, you got the Washita fight in Oklahoma Indian territory right here. And so you can pretty well cover that all in the Central Plains stuff. This is Amanda, and she went by her middle name. I go by my middle name. Mary Fletcher. After her rescue, she married in 1867 and became cook and lived in Davenport, Iowa, and died in Davenport. But she was 17 when she was captured, almost 18. She turned 18 in her captivity. Now, George Bent writes about, actually places himself right there. He doesn't say he was there, but he was. Late in August, this is 1864. This is actually 1865 I'm talking about. I got another quote. In late August 1864, the Indian War broke out in the summer of 1864, August 7th and 8th in Nebraska. As many as 100 settlers and freighters were killed in that violence there. And that's, anyway, late in August, while the young men were still busy raiding on the Platte, this is, the chiefs called a council, and it was decided to write to the authorities, ask for peace, and offer to give up the white prisoners who had been captured during the raids. Well, there were 8 that were captured, they gave up 4. And so on September 4th, in 1864, Ned Wynkoop was a major and was in charge of the old Fort Lyon. They eventually abandoned that. And the Fort Lyon that we have today by the Junta is where they got the other one. Same way Bent's Fort. Bent's original fort was blown up, and it was right next to this Fort Lyon. This was actually Fort Wise, probably when that picture was taken. Wise resigned from the military and joined the Confederacy, so they renamed it after the first officer killed, Nathaniel Lyon, in the Civil War. So Wynkoop was there, commanding. There had been an order issued by Governor Evans when he learned that the outbreak had happened that called for all Colorado citizens to be at war with the Indians. The Indians had been given a warning 2 months earlier, taken to all the agencies, that you stay near the agency. The ones that aren't staying are the ones that are hostile. We're going to fight them. So after 2 months, he gave a second decree, and they were to kill all the Indians and capture the women and children, but kill all young boys and warriors. So they wrote this letter asking for peace, and Bent wrote it in his broken English. He had some training in that. He was a half-blood. William Bent of Bent's Fort was his father, but he married Owl Woman, who was the daughter of the keeper of the sacred arrows of the Cheyenne. and had 4 children. Fourth child died in birth, and then he married his sister and had another boy, Charlie. And Charlie and George were half brothers, and they were in the Indian Wars and this stuff. Charlie was the dangerous one. So George Benton wrote the letter, and then One Eye, missing one eye, Muhammad. They didn't name Muhammad; they called him One Eye. With his wife and a young man named Mininik, who later translates as Eaglehead. And Eaglehead was had 2 young children and a wife, and they got to Fort Lyon, and they weren't shot. They were taken to Wynkoop. Wynkoop first chastised them for not shooting them, and then saw the letter, and then started working out the peace. And he made arrangements to get these captives and brought them into Denver, but he only brought 4. There's a later picture of Eaglehead right here, Mininik, in 1870. These are the 4 captives that were delivered in Denver and released. Unfortunately, the little girl was 3½, and she died from her injuries from her captivity about 3 months after this picture was taken, and then about 6 months. She never did recover from numerous arrow wounds that the newspaper said were poked in her body as torture by the squaws. I'm just telling you what they say. She did die. She never got back to her mother, who was captured and was one of those people in Black Kettle's village that he didn't release. And she had a 10-month-old boy with her, and she stayed in captivity for almost a year when she was rescued. She never got back with this girl because she was dead by the time she was rescued. Little Ambrose Asher was 7, and he looked a lot bigger than the 9-year-old Danny Marble. But if you look at the chair, it's tilted. You see it? If you follow the seat, follow it there, right there. So it was an, anyway. So that's the 9-year-old over there, and I found that out in an Indian depredation claim by his mother, because his father was killed. They were freighted to Denver for a confectionery store. It had a whole wagon full of stuff, and which was Moffat in Woolworth. It had a store in Denver. The Moffat Tunnel ended up in it. And Danny's dad was killed, and he was taken captive, and he never got home. He died of typhoid fever right when she went back home. She was 17 to Nebraska, and the mother wrote Laura about Danny, and she had been informed that Danny had died of typhoid fever. And Laura said in a letter, like the original letters and the claims that I have them all copied, you know, I got to hold them in my hand. And Mrs. Laura Roper says, I have a picture of the 4 of us together, and Danny's in it. If I cannot get a copy made, I'll cut his picture out and send it to you. And in fact, she did that because the book Chief Left Hand by Margaret Cole, a friend of mine, Left Hand was killed at Sand Creek. He was an Arapahoe warrior, chief, a peace chief. Niwot is the Indian name. Anyway, he was killed in all that, and I was going to say something about Danny. In that letter, you know, when she, in Chief Left Hand, Margaret Cole, in doing her research, that book was published in 1984. She got Laura's granddaughter, who was in her 90s, and had that picture with missing Danny's face.
Cut out.
Yeah, so it's cut out. Yeah. So I have that picture in the book, but I didn't put it here. These are the chiefs that were brought in. There's Wynkoop, there's Silas Soul. He says in his letters he refused to fight at Sand Creek, yet in the testimony he said he did fight. And in fact, his soldiers killed several Indians, and there were 5 troopers of the 1st Colorado Cavalry that were killed. This guy here is Bull Bear, and he's the one that led the attack that killed Danny Marble's dad on Plum Creek and all that, and all those freighters. And that Mrs. Morton was taken captive there. One of the freighter's wives was with him, and she was rescued later. And in her testimony, she says it was Bull Bear, and Bull Bear Cheyenne dog soldiers that did all that to him. So we have the straight testimony on it. And here's a Black Kettle there. So these weren't peace chiefs. This was one of your dog soldiers, one that was doing all those murders in Nebraska. And this here is White Antelope. Now, White Antelope signed the treaty in 1851 at Fort Laramie, the Horse Creek Treaty. That's the first Cheyenne treaty. And when you compare that picture with this picture, and you see a guy that might have been in his 50s when he was killed, although the Indians say he was almost 80. If he was almost 80, this is taken just weeks before he was killed. And that's not an 80-year-old Indian, I guarantee you, living out there like that in the sun. And that is. But this is where it all happens, the Sand Creek Massacre. And I'm not going to get into the details of that because we want to get the collateral damage off of it. But it's the only fight west of the Mississippi where we can't get an agreement on the number of people killed and that. There were 23 soldiers killed and 52 wounded. This wasn't a village of old men and women and children to have those kinds of casualties. When you add up over 1,400 fights with the military west of the Mississippi with the Indians, that's how many there were. Sand Creek has only 6 engagements have more U.S. casualties than Sand Creek. So it's controversial. What's not controversial is the anger that Sand Creek produced in the Cheyenne people for what happened with a small number of people there who committed atrocities on women and children. Now, Muhammad put together a nice little flyer about my talk and said a little bit about me. He said my great-great-uncle was at Sand Creek. He's credited with killing Tall Bull. Well, the Indian version is Tall Bull put his hands over like this and sang his death song next to the American flag and did not fight and was murdered. But in the testimony of Sand Creek, where the people are there, where Silent Soul gives his testimony and says that he did engage him. He says, or one guy, Sergeant Decatur, testifies under oath and says this private of the 1st Colorado Cavalry killed Tall Bull. This Sergeant Decatur first wounded him as he was trying to get back into his teepee. This private Henderson came up and killed him. Well, Lieutenant Templeton was with the Pueblo Company. Baxter Road out east was the captain. And Lieutenant Templeton, in his memoirs, which is in the Pioneer Museum in Colorado Springs, said that Hugh Melrose of his company was credited with killing Tall Bull. So we've got 2 people that supposedly killed Tall Bull. I mean, there's controversy everywhere and all over. The interesting thing that Sergeant Decatur, under oath, he said that he was sent by Colonel Shivington to go out the next day and count up all the dead Indians. There were 450, he said. Shivington said there were 500. There's probably only about 140 were killed. So, I mean, there's controversies all over the place, but I don't want to get into that. But other than to say that it inflamed the war, and what happened to, and my uncle, my great-great-uncle, is also testified in the investigations. And he condemns, he says he saw no mutilations or any of that. And he said, but I condemn anybody that would do that. Among the victims were Mimick's wife and 2 daughters, came out from a book called Wrath Trail. This is the site, although I just want to say all the controversies. It's down by Eads, Colorado. You should visit it. It's a very haunting place. They believe that this is where the village was. And this is the marker that's been up there for the 1960s, I think. And actually, the 1,600 acres that they acquired, they have 200 acres where these trees are, and that's where the fight starts. It started on adjacent land, and there are over 6,000 artifacts that have been pulled up on that land, from the cannonballs to all sorts of things, of which the highlight of those artifacts are in the Big Timbers Museum in Lamar, worth a visit. But they retaliated after that, and they attacked Julesburg on January 7th and February 2nd, burning it down on February 2nd. And Platte Bridge up in Casper, Wyoming, where Lieutenant Casper of the 11th Ohio Cavalry, 22 years old, just commissioned, is killed. And his father was William O. Collins, of Fort Collins is named after him. Anyway, they just tore up the country. There were about 1,500 warriors that were doing all this. And they get up at Platte Bridge on July 26, 1865. And here's what bid comes in again, because just 5 days later, on July 31st, the Fletcher family is on their way to California. They've been leisurely coming out. They came out, from Atchison, Kansas on the trail, and they came to Denver. That's not the way to go to California. They would, would go to spend a couple of weeks in Denver. Then they went from Denver up to Fort Laramie. When they got to Fort Laramie, with the war going on, they were held up until there were enough freighters armed, 100 men to go on, which they were ready to go anyway. But they had, listen to this, they had a wagon with all their possessions carried by 2 horses. 2 horses on a wagon you don't take on a trail. And then they had a convenience wagon for the wife and children, it had a little shade, you see those in movies, carried by 1 horse. And so they got with a freight wagon train of 100 wagons that were going to Salt Lake City to the Camp Douglas that was there. They've been there since 1857. And so they were pulled by oxen. Now oxen go about 18, 20 miles a day. A horse can go about 55 miles a day. And a mule can go about 35, 40 miles a day. Oxen don't need as much water. It can carry twice the weight that the mules can. So when you go to those forts and all those supplies for all the forts and commissary and all that, and quartermaster shop, you got huge wagons that have maybe spans 2, 4 spans of oxen carrying it. So you got 8 oxen carrying 1 wagon. And here's the Fletchers on horses. Well, every day that they leave Fort Laramie, they go way in front of the train. They can see it. They can see the dust, so they know, okay, so that's what they did the day they got captured. They were about 4 miles ahead of and they're coming up to Rock Creek Station. There is Mary Fletcher here. I got these off the internet before I met the relatives, so that didn't do very well. That's Jasper Fletcher. Looks a little bit like Jimmy Stewart. So, they came from Derbyshire, England. I've now connected with his brother's descendants. I'm friends on Facebook with them. They found me. 17-year-old Mary, she turned 18, August 19th. 11-year-old William, okay, 11. 6-year-old Jasper, and 4.5-year-old Oscar. And 2-year-old Elizabeth. Actually, she was about, August 6th was her second birthday, so she was not quite 2. She was a week from her second birthday. There's Fort Laramie. You get kind of a look at the wagons. They're going this way when they left. And this is the side of the old Rock Creek. This is on the private property. You can't get there to see it now. I tried to, and I had a guy tell me to drive. I had to drive about 10 miles to this private house. I'm on private property. Didn't you see all the private property? I said, well, I wanted to find that. Did you see the private property, no trespassing? I'm sorry. So I left. So I never did find it. I got these off of the, but you see, off of the internet, you see the hills where the creek is. And that's where they rode to those hills. But the Indians were hiding in the hills and came out and got them in the attack. Mary was holding her mother's hand and carrying Lizzie in the other when the Indians caught them. Mary was instantly killed, the mother. And Amanda, Mary, was taken captive, pulled under a horse while Lizzie was picked up and carried on another. Mary saw Lizzie later that day, but after that, never again throughout her whole 7-month ordeal. She remained captive until February 1866, when a licensed trader, 21-year-old Charles Hanger, was coming down. They were given the annuities to all the Indians south of Fort of Dodge City, probably about 50 miles. So you got the Arapahoe and one big village, and 6 miles over here the Kiowa, and 4 miles over here the Cheyenne. And he was a licensed trader, and he's bringing all his goods to trade because they're getting them all there for the annuities and that. He was able to purchase her for, he traded everything in his wagon, $1,600. He put in a claim for it and didn't get it. He then sent her to an Arapahoe village, which was 7 miles distant, because she said she was afraid she would be kidnapped again because they were going to sell her. Now, the way that she was uncovered is very interesting. I didn't put it in here, it's in my book. She had freckles and kind of red hair stuff and blue eyes, and every few days, they put her in Indian garb, and every few days they burned her face. They put her face in in the campfires in the morning from the coals to keep her eyelids not red and darken her up and all that. So she was in Indian garb, and they talk about when the trader comes, they first have a big celebration, and they get flour and they make flapjacks. Well, Mary knew how to make the pancakes, so they had her. She's going to make the pancakes, and they're getting this, and they wouldn't let her get into the teepee where the trading was, and so anyway, so he gets the flapjacks and gives it to her, and she says to him, "Do you have any soap?" And she spoke English, British English. And the Indians immediately knocked her down because she wasn't supposed to speak. That's when he said, under his oath, that he recognized it was a white woman. And so he worked out the trade. He saved her. And she ended up at Fort Larned and turned over to Agent Wynkoop, who's now out of the military, and he's the agent for the Southern Cheyenne. She eventually ended up in Davenport and married on New Year's Eve in 1867 and raised, I think she had 5 children. Now, it gets into the story. Custer wrote this book in 1874, My Life on the Plains, and he covers his actions up through the Battle of Washita, and he dies in 1876. Well, in one of the chapters, he talks about receiving letters from Mary Fletcher, Amanda Fletcher, and Joseph Fletcher about their daughter, his sister, to find her. And he writes about her. He says, "I have received several letters from the father and eldest daughter and from friends of both requesting me to obtain the release of the little girl if possible. All trace is lost. But there's an Indian named Cutnose on the Smoky Hill who frequently visited the stage stations for purpose of trade and was invariably accompanied by his little captive. He called her Little Silverhair. He appeared to treat her with great affection and always kept her clothed in the handsomest of Indian garments. All offers from individuals to ransom her proved unavailing. Although she had been with the Indians but a year, she spoke the Cheyenne language fluently and seemed to have no knowledge of her mother tongue." Interesting in this with Custer is he doesn't say it in his book, but in the letter that he wrote to the family, and all this stuff ended up in the archives of the Wyoming State Archives, 400 pages of stuff that the granddaughter donated in the early 1960s, late 50s, somewhere like that. And in there was Custer's letter back to them. A copy of it, they had sold that, so they had a copy. And in there he says that Lieutenant Hale, who was killed in the Nez Perce War in 1877, was not at the Little Bighorn. And his scout, Comstock, who was killed right before Beecher Island, were the ones that were in the village and saw the girl and reported it. So we got confirmation from Custer that that girl is still held by the Indians. And he's writing a year later. She's been in captivity for a year, so when he's writing this, it's like 1860s, well, a year later when he had the discussions with the family, but he's writing this in 1874.
Can I ask you something?
Yeah.
That physical description does not jive with what you said. She was red-haired and freckled.
Well, that was her older sister.
Oh.
Yeah, this is Lizzie.
Okay.
Yeah, and she was blonde in this. Yeah. And Mary was kind of a strawberry blonde, I think. So the best way to understand her. They're not really dynamic right there. Mary had placed ads in newspapers asking for help in locating her young sister. This is a little Pueblo connection I put into this. A man in Pueblo named Thomas Harford, and I have a copy of his letter, and it comes from 803 East 5th Street. Read the ad in the Rocky Mountain News, and he wrote Mary. He was at the captivity site shortly after it happened. And this is what he said. "We had a scrap," he was afraid. "We had a scrap with the Indians at Rock Creek," I think I mean that's Wyoming. 3 of our party were killed. There was a man with a family a little ahead of us who had his wagon and outfit destroyed. The man's name was Fletcher. He came to us wounded with arrows. That's accurate. His wife was killed, and the children, I think, was all captured. 1 or 2, I think, were girls. This man Fletcher traveled with us afterwards to Fort Douglas, Utah. So he went with him out there. Well, guess what happened? This was a day after the other freight wagon that they were with. So when they got to When they got to Salt Lake, they found there's no orphanages there. But there was an orphanage in Denver. So they sent the 3 boys back to Denver in a freight train. And so he gets out to Salt Lake City, and his boys aren't there. It took 2 years to reunite them. And he didn't see his daughter Mary, until 1867 or 1870 something. She wouldn't travel until they had the train. So she didn't see him until, it was 1872, I think. So she's captured in 65 and didn't see her dad until 1872, and he died in 1875. So on my way down here today, I found the house, and when I stopped, I was going to take a picture. This guy sitting right there, and he saw me. I said, you know, I better ask the guy. So I walked over. He was real nice to me. He showed me the back of the house and everything. He says, yeah, we knew it was an old house. So I told him the story. He was all excited about it. But it's still there. And that's where he wrote that letter from. Mary also, in the Buffalo Bill Cody, had in his Wild West show a depiction of the captivity of a little girl named Lizzie Fletcher. And so she wrote Cody, and he suggested that she write George Bailey. Cody said the writer of the script didn't have any knowledge of Lizzie and her captivity, but Bent might. So Mary writes George Bent, and George Bent talks about it in his book, The Letters. She told me, Mary, that despite reports to the contrary, she was well treated by her captors. What did Mary say? This is under oath. As for my town and my experience with the Indians, I cannot come into the land